One spark, that's all it took. A kitchen, a flame, a night, and by morning, nothing left. Now imagine it was you. Who would show up? She didn't want pity. She didn't want charity. We're not beggars, she whispered. We just don't have a home anymore. Sometimes the hardest part is letting someone help. One little girl, one small idea. A lemonade stand in the park to help a family that lost everything. Could a single cup really make a difference? No permit, no selling. Just like that, they shut her down. They told her she couldn't help. But Nora, she wasn't the kind of girl who just walks away. Then something happened. One neighbor heard, then another and another. What started with a single cup of lemonade was turning into something nobody saw coming. A single suitcase, a home reduced to ash, a family with nowhere left to go. But one girl wasn't ready to say goodbye, and what she did next changed everything. It started small. A kitchen, late, when everyone should have been asleep. By the time the trucks came, the whole upstairs was gone. Lucy stood on the curb in a borrowed blanket, watching the only home she'd ever known light up the whole street. Her mom held her shoulders. Her dad just stared. Nobody said a word. What was there to say? By the time the fire was out, there was nothing left to do but sit. So that's what Lucy did. On the curb, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, watching strangers walk through what used to be her living room. Smoke still curling up into the dark. She didn't cry. She just watched. Everything she'd ever known, right there in front of her. And none of it hers to keep anymore. Monday, Nora saved her a seat. Like always. Grabbed 2 milks, because Lucy always forgot hers. But the bell rang, and the seat stayed empty. Nora kept watching the door. Through first period, through second. Lucy never came. And that feeling crept in. The one you get when something's wrong, but nobody's told you yet. At recess, Nora went looking. Found her teacher by the doors and asked the question she already half knew the answer to. Her teacher knelt down, said it gently, the way grown-ups do when the news is bad. There'd been a fire. Lucy's family was safe. But the house? Gone. Everything in it, gone. And Nora just stood there, the words not quite landing. She ran the whole way home. Backpack bouncing, shoes barely tied. Burst through the door and found her mom in the kitchen. Mom, Lucy's house. It burned. It's gone, all of it. Grace turned around, dish towel still in her hand. Saw her daughter's face and didn't ask a single question. Just opened her arms. Some news you don't explain. You just hold someone through it. The next day, Nora and her mom drove over to the motel. Room 12. 2 beds, a little kettle. Everything the Reynolds had left fit in one corner. Lucy sat on the bed, holding the one thing she'd grabbed on her way out. A worn little teddy bear, its fur gone dark with smoke. She held it like it might disappear too. Nora and Grace stayed by the door, quiet. Some grief you don't walk into. You wait until you're asked. When the grown-ups stepped out, it was just the 2 of them. And that's when Lucy finally broke. People keep bringing us stuff, she whispered. Clothes, food, like we're some kind of charity. Her voice cracked. We're not beggars, Nora. We don't have a home anymore. Nora didn't try to fix it. Didn't have the words. She just reached over and held her friend's hand. Tight. Outside, by the car, the 2 moms talked low. Grace just listened. Laura's eyes were red, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. My sister's got room, she said. 3 towns over. We can't stay here, Grace. There's nothing left to stay for. She wiped her face fast, embarrassed by the tears. We leave at the end of the week. And just like that, Lucy was going away. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. End of the week, 5 days. She kept doing the math in her head, except there was no math. Just a friend leaving, and no way to stop it. Then she thought about summer, the corner of Maple Street. That line of kids who'd paid a whole $1 for a cup of lemonade just because it was hot out. And she sat straight up in the dark. A stand. She could raise the money herself. She could give Lucy a reason to stay. First thing next morning, she called Mia, her best friend since kindergarten, the one who always said yes before Nora even finished asking. "I need your help," Nora said. "It's for Lucy." She explained the whole thing in one breath. The fire, the motel, the money, the stand. There was a pause on the line. Then Mia just said, "I'll bring the cups." That was it. 2 girls, 1 plan. Saturday morning, they set up on the corner of Maple Street. A folding table from Mia's garage. A pitcher of lemonade Nora's mom helped them make. Too sweet, probably, but who's counting? And the sign. They'd worked on it the night before, taking turns with the markers, arguing over the letters. "Lemonade for Lucy," it said. $1. Nora taped it to the front of the table and stepped back to look. It wasn't much. A card table, a pitcher, 2 folding chairs. But it was something. It was a start. Mia poured the first cup just to test it, made a face, and they both laughed. For a second, it felt easy. Like all they had to do was sit there and the money would come. They'd find out soon enough. It's never that easy. The morning was slow. A jogger stopped. An old man walking his dog bought 2 cups, told them to keep the change. By noon, they had $11 in the jar, and Nora was starting to believe. Then a boy from the grade above rode up on his bike. Stopped. Read the sign out loud, slow, like it was funny. "Lemonade for Lucy," he said. "Isn't that the girl whose house burned down? What is this? Charity?" Mia's face went red. Nora just looked at him. Didn't say a word. He smirked, shrugged, rode off. And for a minute, neither of them moved. Because that was the thing they'd been afraid to say out loud, that maybe it was charity, that maybe Lucy would hate it. Nora looked down at the jar. $11. And a whole long way to go. By the time the sun went down, the lemonade was gone, and so were the customers. Nora carried the jar home, sat down at the kitchen table, and counted it out. Quarters, crumpled ones, a lonely 5. $23. She counted it twice just to be sure. 23. She wrote the number in her notebook, under the goal she'd set at the top, and stared at the gap between them. Because she knew what $23 meant. A motel costs money. A fresh start costs money. $23 wouldn't cover a single night. She rested her chin in her hand and did the math she didn't want to do. The Reynolds were leaving in 4 days. 4 days. And a kitchen table full of coins. It wasn't going to be enough. Not even close. And sitting there alone, she let herself feel it. Just for a minute. By the time the sun went down, the lemonade was gone, and so were the customers. Nora carried the jar home, sat down at the kitchen table, and counted it out. Quarters, crumpled ones, a lonely 5. $23. She counted it twice just to be sure. 23. She wrote the number in her notebook, under the goal she'd set at the top, and stared at the gap between them. Because she knew what $23 meant. A motel costs money. A fresh start costs money. $23 wouldn't cover a single night. She rested her chin in her hand and did the math she didn't want to do. The Reynolds were leaving in 4 days. 4 days, and a kitchen table full of coins. It wasn't going to be enough. Not even close. And sitting there alone, she let herself feel it. Just for a minute. Sunday morning, Nora was back on the corner before anyone else was even awake. Alone this time. Mia had church, and Nora hadn't wanted to wait. She set the table up herself, dragged it, wobbling, across the grass, poured the lemonade, taped the sign, straightened it twice. The street was quiet. Just her, a card table, and a stubborn kind of hope. She wasn't going to quit. Not because the math worked, it didn't. Not because anyone told her to keep going, nobody had. But because Lucy was her friend, and her friend was running out of time. So she sat down in the folding chair, folded her hands, and waited for the first car to come. She had no idea that the next person to stop wasn't going to be a customer at all. She'd barely been open an hour when the man walked up. Button-up shirt, a badge clipped to his pocket, a clipboard in one hand. Nora smiled, reached for a cup, a customer, finally. But he didn't want lemonade. "You got a permit for this?" he asked. Nora blinked. "A what?" "A vendor's permit. You can't sell things on public property without one." "But I'm just trying to help my friend." "Sorry, kid. Rules are rules. You'll have to pack it up." And that was it. He tapped his clipboard, said it kindly enough, but the answer didn't change. No permit, no stand. Nora looked at her little table. The pitcher, the cups, the sign she'd made by hand. And one by one, every door that could have helped Lucy was quietly closing. She started taking the sign down. Slow, her hands not quite steady. But this wasn't where she gave up. She carried the table home by herself, set it against the garage, leaned the sign beside it, and sat down right there on the curb. For a while, she just sat. The pitcher empty. The cups still stacked. $23 and a permit she didn't have. Lucy was leaving in 3 days, and Nora had run clean out of corner. She pressed the back of her hand to her eyes, not crying exactly, just tired in a way kids aren't supposed to know yet. And then she stopped. Because sitting there feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to keep her friend in town. One girl on one corner wasn't enough. The man with the clipboard had proved that. But what if it wasn't one girl? What if it was the whole town? She stood up, wiped her face, and went to find a better idea. On her way home, Nora cut past Lucy's old street. The burned house was still there. Quiet now, roped off, just blackened wood against a gray sky. And standing on the sidewalk across from it was a man she knew by face, but not by name. Mr. Kowalski, the one always watching from his porch, the one who complained about everything. She'd heard somebody call the city about a lemonade stand in the park, and something in her just knew. "Was it you?" she asked. "Did you report me?" He looked at her, arms crossed, face like stone. Didn't say yes, didn't say no, just, "Rules are rules." Nora felt her face go hot. All she'd wanted was to help, and here was a grown man, standing in front of a burned house, worried about a permit. She turned and walked off before she said something she'd regret. Monday, at lunch, Nora couldn't sit still. She stood up right there at the cafeteria table and told her friends everything. About Lucy, the fire, the motel, the little bear gone gray with smoke. About the corner, the $23, the man with the clipboard who shut her down. Her friends stopped eating. just listened. And then she said the thing she'd figured out sitting on that curb. One stand isn't enough. But if all of us did it, lemonade, cookies, anything, this weekend, all over town, nobody could shut us all down. For a second, nobody said anything. Then one of the boys nodded. I'll ask my parents tonight. Me too, said the girl beside him. And that was how it started. Quiet, over lunch trays, each kid went home and told their family. And by the next morning, half the school was already talking about Lucy. By Saturday, Maple Street didn't look like Maple Street anymore. It looked like a fair. Lemonade stands, a cookie table, a kid selling friendship bracelets out of a shoebox, hand-painted signs in every yard, and every single one of them had the same name on it. Lucy. Mrs. Diaz, who ran the corner grocery, rolled out a whole cart of lemons and cups and paper bags and just said, "Take whatever you need. No charge." Parents set up folding tables. Little kids ran change back and forth. And in the middle of it all stood Nora, watching the things she'd dreamed up on her bedroom floor turn real, right in front of her eyes. It wasn't one girl on a corner anymore. It was a whole neighborhood. And somewhere across town, in a motel room with a packed suitcase, Lucy had no idea what was coming. By noon, the street was so busy that somebody must have made a call. Because a van pulled up at the end of Maple Street, local news, a camera on a shoulder rig, a woman with a microphone, and a list of questions she never ended up needing. She walked the rows of stands slow, taking it all in. The lemonade, the cookies, the hand-painted signs in every yard. And she kept asking the same thing. Who started all this? Who's the one behind it? And every kid she asked pointed in the same direction. At a girl in a red hoodie, refilling a pitcher like it was the most normal thing in the world. The reporter crouched down to her level, held out the mic, and asked Nora why. Why all of this for one family? Nora thought about it for a second, and then she just shrugged and told the truth. My friend lost her house, she said. She's supposed to move away, and I didn't want her to go. That was it. No big speech, no fancy words. Just a 10-year-old saying the simplest thing in the world. The reporter smiled, lowered the mic, and said thank you. And that night, the whole town sat down in their living rooms and watched a kid explain, in one sentence, what it actually means to show up for somebody. By the next morning, the story had spread further than any of them expected. Cars slowed down on Maple Street. Strangers showed up with folded bills, and the jars kept filling, faster than anyone could count. Nora had wanted to help one friend. She had no idea she was about to move a whole town. Somebody had to go get them. So Nora did. She slipped away from the stand, walked the whole way to the motel by herself, and knocked on the door of room 12. She didn't explain, just took Lucy by the hand and said, "Come with me. You have to see something." Lucy's parents followed behind, confused, the three of them trading looks the whole way down the block. And then they turned the corner onto Maple Street, and Lucy stopped dead. The whole street, end to end, tables and tents and balloons, banners strung between the trees. Kids she half recognized from school, neighbors she'd never even met, all of them busy, all of them working. And every single sign had the same word painted across it. Her name. Lucy. Laura's hand went straight to her mouth. James just stood there, blinking, like he couldn't make the picture make sense. And Lucy turned to Nora, opening her mouth to say something and finding nothing there at all. "You did this?" she finally managed. Nora shook her head. "Not just me. she said quietly. Everybody. And it was true. It wasn't one girl on a corner anymore. It was a whole town that had heard about a family with nowhere to go and decided, without anybody asking, that they weren't going to let it happen. For a long moment, the three Reynolds just stood at the edge of it all, taking it in. The mother who'd said they were leaving, the father who'd run out of answers, and the girl who'd lost her home and thought she'd lost her friends with it. Standing at the front of a street that was telling them, in the loudest way a town can, "You belong here. Stay." By Sunday evening, the stands were packed up, lemonade gone, and it was finally time to count. They hauled it all to one long folding table out in the middle of the street. Every jar, every envelope, every coffee can heavy with coins. Whole neighborhood gathered round to watch. Mrs. Diaz from the corner grocery took charge. Reading glasses on, notepad in front of her, the way she'd counted register drawers for 30 years. The kids dumped the jars out in a great rattling pile. Bills got smoothed flat and stacked. Quarters into little towers, dimes and nickels sorted into rows. Nobody really knew what to expect. A few hundred, maybe. Enough for a couple more weeks at the motel, if they were lucky. Nora stood right next to Lucy and held her breath without meaning to. Laura and James held on to each other at the edge of the crowd, and Mrs. Diaz started calling out numbers as the piles grew. 100, 200, then 5. People started to murmur, kids up on tiptoe to see over the table. And still the bills kept coming, out of pockets, out of envelopes, pressed flat and added to the stack. 1,000. The murmur turned into something else. Hope, maybe. The kind that's almost scary to feel, because of how much it had hurt to lose it. Nora squeezed Lucy's hand. Lucy squeezed back. Neither of them said a word. The number on Mrs. Diaz's notepad kept climbing, line after line. Already more than any of them had dared to imagine when this whole thing started on a quiet corner with a card table and $23. But the night still had one more surprise in it, and it was about to walk right up the sidewalk. That's when Nora saw him. Coming up the sidewalk, slow, hands buried in his coat pockets. Mr. Kowalski. The man who'd stood in front of a burned house and talked to her about rules. The man she was almost certain had picked up a phone and reported her little stand to the city. Her stomach dropped right through the pavement. Of course he'd show up now. At the best moment, the happiest moment. The one she'd worked so hard for. Just to find something wrong with it. The noise, the permits, the kids blocking the sidewalk, the crowd taking up the street. She could already hear it, and without even thinking, she stepped out in front of the table. Like she could put herself between this man and everything they'd built. Like her small body could shield a whole town's worth of kindness from one cold word. The crowd noticed him too. The cheering died down. The clapping stopped. People turned, one by one, and a quiet settled over Maple Street as the old man walked straight up to the table and stopped. He looked down at the money, the stacks of bills, the towers of coins. He looked at the signs with Lucy's name painted across them in a child's handwriting. And for a long, long second, he didn't say anything at all. Nora's heart was pounding. She lifted her chin, set her jaw, and got ready. Ready to argue. Ready to defend every cup of lemonade and every single kid who'd given up their weekend. Whatever he was about to say, she decided she wasn't going to let him take this away. But what Mr. Kowalski did next, Nora never could have guessed it. and neither could anyone else standing on that street. He reached into his coat. Slow. And he pulled out an envelope, thick, the corners worn soft, like he'd been carrying it around for a while, turning it over in his hands. He held it out to Nora. She didn't move. She just stared at it, not understanding. So he leaned forward and set it down on the table, right beside the pile of money. "Count it later," he said. His voice was low, rough, but not cold. Not this time. Somebody did count it later, and when they did, the whole street went silent. $1,000. 1,000. From the man everyone called the grump, the complainer, the one who watched the neighborhood from his porch and never had a kind word for anybody. Nora looked up at him, her mouth open, the question all over her face. Why? And Mr. Kowalski looked down at her, and for the first time since she'd known his face, it wasn't made of stone. There was something soft in it, something old and tired and kind. "I lost everything once, too," he said quietly. "A long time ago now. House, everything in it. And I'll tell you what I remember most about it." He paused, swallowed. Nobody came. Nobody showed up for me. He looked over at Lucy, standing wide-eyed beside her mother. "So you make sure," he said, "that somebody shows up for her." And that was all. He gave a single nod, turned, and walked back the way he'd come, hands in his pockets, head down, before a single person could thank him. Nora watched him go, and she understood right then something it takes most people a whole lifetime to learn: that the coldest people are sometimes just the ones who got left out in the cold. Mrs. Diaz set down her pen. She looked at the final number on her notepad. Then she looked again, just to be sure she hadn't made a mistake. And when she read it out loud, for one full second, nobody on that street believed her. $2,847. From cups of lemonade, from cookies and friendship bracelets and coffee cans full of coins, from a town full of people who decided, one by one, that a family they barely knew was worth showing up for. And then the second passed, and the street exploded. Grace threw both arms straight up in the air and shouted. Nora jumped so high, her feet left the ground again and again, like she couldn't contain it. And Lucy just turned into her mother and held on, burying her face, her shoulders shaking, finally letting go of everything she'd been carrying since the night the smoke filled the sky. Laura was crying without even trying to hide it now. James had one hand pressed over his face, the other wrapped around his wife and his daughter both. All around them, neighbors clapped and cheered and hugged total strangers, the way people do when something good happens that's bigger than all of them. It was enough. After everything, the slow days, the man with the clipboard, the boy on the bike, the $23 that felt like nothing. It was finally, truly enough. Enough for a deposit, enough for a fresh start, enough for a family to stop running and stay. The fire had taken everything from the Reynolds in a single night. And in a single afternoon, a whole town had gathered every piece it could find and handed it right back to them, one cup at a time. Later, when the noise had settled and most of the crowd had drifted home, Laura found Nora's mom standing off to the side. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked out at the empty street, at the folded tables and the trampled grass and the last few balloons bobbing in the breeze. "I almost said no," Laura admitted. Her voice was thick. "When I heard what the kids were doing, I wanted to march down here and make them stop." She wiped her eyes. Because taking help, it felt like admitting we'd failed. Like the whole town would see us as the family that couldn't take care of itself. Grace didn't say anything. She just listened. And then I got here, Laura went on, and I saw all of it. All those signs with my daughter's name, and I realized none of these people think we've failed. They just, her voice broke. They just didn't want us to be alone. She finally let herself cry, really cry, the way she hadn't since the night of the fire. And Grace reached over and took her hand and held it. Across the street, Lucy and Nora sat on the curb together, knees pulled up, watching their moms. "Does this mean you're staying?" Nora asked. Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then a smile crept across her face, the first real one in weeks. "Yeah," she said. "I think we're staying." And Nora let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for days. Because that, not the money, not the news cameras, not even the $1,000 envelope, that was the thing she'd been fighting for the whole time. Her friend, right here, not going anywhere. Pride is a hard thing to put down. But sometimes the people around you make it just a little bit easier. The money was only the beginning. Because once a town like that gets going, it doesn't quite know how to stop. The day the Reynolds got the keys to their new place, the whole street showed up to fill it. Somebody had a spare couch sitting in a garage. Somebody else brought a kitchen table that had been collecting dust in a basement for years. A lamp, a box of mismatched dishes, bags and bags of clothes that finally found the right home. A neighbor pulled up with a moving truck and just started unloading. And before long, there was a whole line of people carrying furniture up the front walk, calling out to each other, laughing in the sunshine. And there, moving slower than the rest, carrying a box marked "Fragile," with both arms wrapped careful around it, was Mr. Kowalski. The grump, the complainer, the man with the cold face that wasn't so cold anymore, working harder than anybody half his age and not saying a word about it. Lucy and Nora hauled boxes too, bumping shoulders in the doorway, arguing about which room was whose, getting in everybody's way and not caring one bit. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't the old house, with all its memories and its history and the marks on the door frame where Lucy had grown up. Nothing could give that back. But by the time the sun went down that evening, the new place had a couch to sit on, a table to eat at, a lamp glowing warm in the front window, and every single thing inside it had come from somebody who'd looked at a family in trouble and thought, "Not on my street. You don't lose everything, not while we're here." That first night in the new place was quiet. The boxes were mostly unpacked. The neighbors had all gone home. And for the first time in weeks, the Reynolds sat down together under their own roof. A roof that was theirs now, paid for by a town that barely knew them. Lucy walked slowly from room to room, running her hand along the walls, learning the place. It still smelled like fresh paint and cardboard. It didn't sound like the old house. The floors creaked in different spots. The light came through the windows at a different angle in the evening. It wasn't home yet, not really. But it would be. She could already feel it. She found the little teddy bear, the one she'd grabbed on the way out the night of the fire. Its fur still gone gray at the edges. And she set it on the windowsill in her new room, where it could catch the morning sun. Out in the living room, Laura and James stood close together, looking at the couch a stranger had given them, the table another stranger had carried in, the lamp glowing soft in the corner. "We're okay," James said quietly. Not quite a question. Laura leaned her head on his shoulder. We're okay, she agreed. And somewhere across town, in her own bed, Nora lay awake too, not worrying this time, not doing math she didn't want to do. Just smiling at the ceiling in the dark, because her friend was still here, in the same town, a bike ride away. And tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days after, they'd still get to be exactly what they'd always been. Best friends. That was the whole reason. That was everything. A few weeks later, you'd never have guessed how close it all came. The Reynolds were home. Really home now. Settled into a place on a street full of people who knew their names and waved when they passed. The new house had become a real one, the way new houses do. Dishes in the cupboards, shoes by the door, that little gray teddy bear sitting on a windowsill, catching the morning light. One evening, the whole group ended up together on the new front steps. Lucy and Nora, both sets of parents, lemonade in paper cups, the sun going down soft and orange behind the rooftops. And Lucy, out of nowhere, got quiet. Can I say something? She asked. Everyone looked at her. When our house burned, I thought my life was over. I thought we'd have to leave and start again somewhere nobody knew us. I was so ashamed. She looked at Nora. And then you did something crazy. You set up a lemonade stand to save my whole family. She laughed, shaking her head. It was $23 the first day, Nora admitted. But you didn't stop. And because you didn't stop, nobody else stopped either. Lucy's voice cracked. You taught me something I didn't know. That asking for help isn't weak, it's brave. And that we're never really alone, even when it feels like we are. Laura wiped her eyes. James pulled her close, and Nora thought about it for a second, then said the things she'd figured out somewhere along the way. One person can't do everything, she said. But one person can start something. And if enough people join in, anything's possible. Grace raised her cup to new beginnings. And everyone raised theirs and drank and laughed and watched the sky go dark together. And somewhere down the block, on a porch that had sat empty for years, an old man sat out in the evening air. Mr. Kowalski. He lifted a hand and waved at a neighbor walking by, and the neighbor, surprised, waved right back. And Mr. Kowalski smiled. Just a little? Just enough. Because here's the thing Nora will carry her whole life. Sometimes a house burns down. Sometimes a family loses everything they have in one terrible night. Sometimes the world feels dark and cold and impossible. But sometimes a 10-year-old girl sets up a lemonade stand. And sometimes that's all it takes to remind a whole neighborhood what it means to care, to help, to show up for each other. Because at the end of the day, we were never meant to face this life alone. We were meant to face it together. And out on the front steps, shoulder to shoulder, two best friends watched the first fireflies blink on in the dark. Best friends forever? Lucy whispered. Nora smiled. Forever and ever.